A key component of the modern world economy, the chemical industry delivers products and innovations to enhance everyday life. It is also an industry in transformation, where chemical executives and workers are delivering growth and industry-changing advancements while responding to pressures from investors, regulators, and public opinion. Discover how leading companies are approaching these challenges here on The Chemical Show. Join Victoria Meyer, president of Progressio Global and host of The Chemical Show, as she speaks with executives across the industry and learns how they are leading their companies to grow, transform, and push industry boundaries on all frontiers. Here's your host, Victoria Meyer.
Hi, this is Victoria Meyer. Welcome back to The Chemical Show. This week, I am speaking with Karen Tkaczyk, who is the Director of Life Sciences, Regulated, and Enterprise Solutions at MasterWord, where she helps chemical, energy, and life science companies do business globally with minimal risk. Karen has a really unique combination of industrial and service experience. She's a PhD chemist, is a linguistics whiz, particularly in French, and today she does lots of technical translation. So it's a really interesting space in the industry, and one that is really highly needed. So Karen and I are going to be talking about translation services, COVID's impact on the supply chain of service workers, and much more. Karen, welcome to The Chemical Show.
Well, thank you for having me, Victoria. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. Let's start with your origin story. What's your origin story?
Yeah.
What got you interested in chemistry? And ultimately, what got you to what I would consider a non-traditional field for a PhD chemist?
Right, absolutely. What got me? Middle school, the teacher doing demonstration of how metals react in water. We were learning about the periodic table. You know, flame color, whether they fizz, whether they, that's my first love, chemistry answer to that question. What was the thing that got me loving chemistry? I
really liked blowing up soap bubbles, like creating a gas into soap bubbles and boom, they explode. That was
lovely.
Pretty fun.
Well, how surfactants work is fun and lovely as well. Yeah, very good. No, I still remember potassium burns with a lilac flame and magnesium, that bright white. Anyway, that was when I fell in love with chemistry. I also always loved languages, so I was trying throughout high school to study both as much science as I could, leaning chemistry, and as much language as I could, and I ended up in my undergraduate degree in the UK would be an equivalent of what you would say chemistry major with a French minor. And I did spend a year abroad working in a pharma company, Rompulanc. It's now part of Sanofi Aventis. So that so I loved chemistry all through that time. I was the kind who went to organic chemistry in college and fell more in love with organic chemistry and kept going in that direction, right? We all know there's a split.
Not me.
Right?
Okay.
We all know the clear split when you study organic chemistry, right? So I loved it, and I went headlong into that, and went on to do a PhD in organic synthetic methodology in Cambridge with the late great Dr. Stuart Warren. He died last year. So early on in that PhD, though, I realized that I didn't want to be in academia. I definitely didn't want to be in that end of the spectrum. I wanted to apply the science. So when I got out, I worked as a development chemist for what was then GlaxoSmithKline. So no, it was then SmithKline Beecham, right? We all know what it is now, right? Near Cork in Ireland. Still loved chemistry, but we moved to the States. So my husband, we wanted an adventure. My husband is French. The last name comes from his family. He's Polish, Polish and French. Anyway, so when I moved to the States, I got a job in a cosmetics and medical device company. Think lotions and potions, wound gels, moisturizing. So that was broadening my experience, broadening my industrial experience. Formulation chemistry is a different kind of chemistry than the heavily organic synthetic pharma life sciences stuff I had started with. So that was really my chemistry early career. Then we had kids. So that's where the switch started. I did go back to work, but then I decided I didn't want to work. I took a break, had 2 more kids. And that was where, as a person, as a housewife, I suppose I discovered freelance translation. So I became a linguist at that point, translating chemistry. So that was where the switch happened.
Yeah. And I guess I don't often think of translators having the academic and chemistry prowess that you have.
Right.
But it's really interesting.
Yeah, you'll find it very much in this world of language services. You'll find people who specialize in automotive or in legal or in whatever it is. Because you can't translate something you don't understand, right? I don't like translating contracts, for instance. I don't like reading contracts in English, right? Even when I have to sign them. So I wouldn't want to translate one, right? But you can't translate a chemistry patent or even a safety data sheet if you don't understand the chemistry, right? So yeah, so there's a whole world out there of engineers and scientists translating for language services industry with subject matter expertise. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So tell us a little bit about MasterWord. Which is where you are at today.
Yeah. So MasterWord is it's a Houston-based company based in the energy corridor. It's a full-service language services company. So what is that, you're asking? It provides, think about translation, the written word documents, spoken word, interpreters in meetings or wherever you are, subtitling, voiceover, sign language, Braille. So it's language services in the broadest sense that you can think of. It's any language, anywhere. It's public and private sector. And we got our start in the energy industry. The owner, the woman, we're woman founded, woman owned. My boss, the CEO, is a Russian American who got her start helping a super major in the energy industry, doing projects in what's now the former Soviet Union. So that's how so it began with a Russian speaking American, and 30 years later, we're pretty much any language, any time, any sector. You can imagine anything. The hospital systems need interpreters. Your courts and local government to corporate America, taking corporate America global. The works.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. In fact, that's a good lead into my next question, which is when and where do companies use translation services? Let's maybe, I particularly think about the energy and chemicals and material science industry.
Absolutely.
When do people know, how do they know that they need services, it's a great question. How do they find you?
Yes. Well, how they find us, it's usually word of mouth these days because we have enough accounts in the field that it's like, who are you using? I can't do this in English. How do I do this in Korean? Whatever the case. But so they use anything from, let's say, sales and marketing materials, right? Something that they're trying to get into a new market, or they're trying to, biz dev, the standard stuff, and you can't always do it in English. There's a line we use, can't read, won't buy, and it particularly affects B2C. But in our B2B world, there are situations where English doesn't cut it, right? If you're, corporate America trying to take your business global. And then it's your employees, safety. I mean, it's all about mitigating risk and safety. That's a lot of it is about mitigating risk and safety. Are the people on your plant, your rig, your site, native English speakers or not? And to what extent do the safety notices, to give a simple example, what is it really okay that they're only in English, or that the safety training is only in English, or should you really be giving that in another language as well? So that's another good example. Then you can go all the way to labeling, safety data sheets, product data sheets, that sort of purchasing you might have regulatory driven translation needs depending on the nature of the product you're selling. So
that's interesting.
Some examples. IP, that's the other big one. Your patents, where are you filing your patents? In some, depending on your patent jurisdiction, You might be filing it only in English, but you might be filing your patents in another language. So IP is another area where people come for translation.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it is, we're in such a global business environment. And as an American English speaker, it's easy to think, well, everybody, English is the business language, but we all know it's not around the world, right? Even though, and I've
it is a lingua franca, and it's often the starting point, but it's not often the best end point. Right. Depending on the nature of your clients and your business and which country you're. I mean, you could be trying to do business in Canada, in Quebec. In Quebec, it's regulated. You have to use French and English. So we do a lot of translation into French for Canada for a lot of American companies because they can't.
I can see that.
Yeah, we do.
And I think even just as you mentioned, or a lot of times the operators, the manufacturing, the lab workers don't necessarily have the same language skills that the engineers or the business leaders may have that maybe have multiple language sets, but others don't. And I know I've run into that myself. When I was at Shell, I was in the Netherlands often. And you kind of become used to the fact that everybody I talk to that's Dutch speaks English really well. And then I would get around some manufacturing or some lab workers or some of the operators, and I find out, oh yeah, they don't have the same English skills. Like I could talk to them, and I'm like, oh no, it is not, the translation's not there. So that whole aspect of working in a global environment and needing to adapt to everyone's languages. I
have done exactly that recently this year when on site to a plant had a shutdown because their operators had been trained in English, not in the other language they needed to be trained in. And so we translated the slide decks, and then we sent interpreters in to interpret live during the training. And I was there. This was a mission critical type situation, so I was there supervising. And it was exactly the situation you're describing, where the graduate, the engineers, the leaders, they're all bilingual, but you just can't count on that for everyone.
Right. Absolutely. So where we started this conversation, or when we had reached out to each other, the pandemic and the events of the past 3 years, we have been talking about the supply chain challenges that have come about as a result of that. And I think we often think of that as goods. Whatever my new computer that I ordered is not showing up. The chemical products aren't getting where they need to be, and we're still seeing the after effects of that. How did that affect service businesses such as MasterWord?
Yeah. So immediately the main effect was that everybody cut their budgets. That was the first, right? Spring 2020, when we were all in, a pivoting mode or catastrophe mode before we were even pivot. Anyway, so budget cuts. That was the first thing initially. And then also, if you think about our business being written word, sure, we can do, but the spoken word, people were going in person, interpreters in person. That couldn't happen anymore. So we had a technology shift within the language services industry where it's now completely normal for on a meeting like this for the interpreter to join your Zoom call and for the listeners to choose between the English language channel or the channel of the interpreter who's on the call. And they're just so we had a technological shift in our particular industry.
Okay, so now I'm curious. Can you do that on Zoom, or is it another app?
Yeah, no, really all the big platforms. Yes, you can, absolutely.
I can turn off who I'm listening to.
You can.
That's really awesome. I didn't know that.
Yes, you can switch from the English channel to the Spanish or the Chinese or the Arabic or whatever channel it is you need to listen to. Yeah, all the major platforms we might use for online meetings do that, and then we have our own. Platform. Some customers prefer to use our platform because then we handle the technology behind the scenes and who's showing up in the meeting links and stuff. And some customers prefer to do it on their own system. But yes, you can certainly do that. So there was that sort of technological pivot that we had. It was like an existential crisis for the interpreters of the world who had been used to traveling to the site to work with people, and suddenly they were sitting behind a desk looking at a screen all day. So that was one part, specific to language services. More generally for service providers in the supply chain, we were just sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a moment. So the budgets died, right? The budgets died, and then everyone started to settle, right? And then we're like, okay, so what's next? So our revenue dropped hugely in 2020, and it rose again. It rose nicely in 2021. Then we had sharp growth in 2022. So we can tell that customers are coming back. Okay, they know they need us. They're growing again themselves. That pattern's probably realistic across the board for many service providers, because people just stop, not just language services, whatever other professional services you're buying.
Did it change your talent availability, right? So I know that one of the things we've certainly seen over the past several years is a shift in talent availability. And I guess maybe two things with that. One, it's just the availability of talent. Is there a talent shortage? Number two, because now that you talk about using Zoom in lieu of in-person translation, is your industry, are you guys seeing the same? I don't want to go back to work, or go back to the office, or go back to traveling. So how is this affecting talent? What's going on with your talent base?
So first of all, does the talent exist? It depends on the language combination and the subject matter. So I would say, generally speaking, like if you want Spanish in North America, there's not really a talent shortage. You just need to pay for the right person with the right subject matter expertise. However, you tell me you want a rarer language, then we're starting to get into shortages, especially if you want credentialed people. So there are shortages, I would say not across the board, but in the more specialized, the rarer languages or the rarer subject needs. What we did find more than a talent shortage is that the linguists, when inflation hit, the linguists all wanted to raise their rates, quite rightly.
Sure, why not?
Because the linguists are the little guy who've been squeezed, right? And they didn't want it. They started pushing back in significant numbers as we saw this, inflation, global inflation. But then it's like, okay, how much can we raise our rates? How much can we tighten our margins? Where are we going with this? How that's affected us is that we can still find linguists, but can we raise our prices? Are we squeezing our margins? That's the eternal debate that's going to be the same for all service providers.
And that's every business's great debate, right? So can you pass your costs through?
Right. That's really that's been the big battle. And in fact, we had to do it for some language. So here's a good example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we had to close our Russia office, among other things, right? Like we had to get out of Russia, like a lot of people. But also we couldn't use any linguists based in Russia. So all the linguists we were using for translation into Russian, which is of course not only for Russia, we may not be doing business for Russia anymore, but we've still got projects in Kazakhstan or, elsewhere, other Russian-speaking countries. And so we had to raise our rates for Russian specifically because we couldn't so we were mainly using US-based Russian speakers and Russian. And they charge much more than the global population of Russian speakers. So there's an example where we had a geopolitical situation that meant we made a blanket decision to raise rates for that single language because we decided we would use largely US-based or Ukraine-based Russian speakers. So that's a very specific example, but it's a real one, and it would the geopolitical events do.
Where do most of your translators reside, I guess? So I mean, is your translation services kind of clustered by region?
So for instance, there's a whole there's a cluster in the Houston area, Texas as a whole, I would say, because we do a lot of in-person stuff in the state. However, all over the US, we have providers in many languages, and then all over the world. So let me give you an example of why. If you are trying to do business in Vietnam, the Vietnamese that Vietnamese speakers in Vietnam speak is not the same as the immigrant Vietnamese population in the US. So if I'm helping a company sell to Vietnam a new chemical plant, for instance, we need Vietnamese translators who are in Vietnam. If my colleague who handles healthcare contracts for MasterWord is helping a hospital system in downtown Houston, provide Vietnamese, he needs to use Vietnamese linguists who live in the US and who understand the differences between their. It's like my English and your English, right? It's not the same language, right? So that's really, so the answer is we've got people everywhere, and according to the account we're dealing with, we know which set of linguists we need to provide for that account.
Yeah. Is it that slang or colloquialisms work their way in, or is it the actual formal language is somewhat different?
It varies, so depends on the language. So let's use English as an example, since all your listeners will have that as a core. Yes, of course, it could be sports idioms, right? It could be the way we describe holidays. The holidays aren't, there's no Memorial Day in the UK, or there's, you don't celebrate, you don't talk about cricket here. So it could be that kind of thing, but it could be a political matter. It could be how you talk about, for instance, what kind of Chinese are we translating into? Is it Taiwan? Is it going to be language that Taiwanese people approve of, or mainland Chinese people, or Hong Kong Chinese? So there's political considerations, as well as the obvious things like holidays and date format and time format might not be the same. In Vietnam, they might use a certain date and time format, and here they've adopted to use the US system. It's a whole sort of package of things that we call localization. So you're making something fit for the locale concerned, and that may be it may be that grammar is different. For instance, UK and US, we use certain different grammatical structures.
And the spelling is certainly different, right?
It certainly is. And there are lots of options. And there's just things that sound wrong in a certain culture or context that sound right in another culture or context. And it's all about having the right linguists for the context. So it's always about what the fit for the context is.
Yeah, great. So let's talk about the customer experience, because it's something that we talk about regularly on the Chemical Show.
Yes, it is.
How do you and MasterWord think about this? Is there a MasterWord way? When you think about kind of just the wide variety of customers and freelancers and employees and what have you, how do you define customer experience? How do you create, or do you even try to create, a single customer experience?
No, because we have to adapt it for each vertical that we're selling to. The way we're doing business, the way you would sell to a public sector versus private sector is radically different, right? So there's no single MasterWord way. Do we have the customer experience in mind, customer focus? Of course. But we have entirely different sets of marketing materials, for instance, for the market we're going after.
Right.
What would work? I'm typically helping corporate America go global, or a service provider try to do business with a US company, right? That's typically what I'm doing. The problem I'm trying to solve is growing their business, or sometimes it's internal. It's how can we have our employees better trained, our global employee base better trained, or our so that's the kinds of problems I'm solving. And you can imagine what my customer focus would look like. We talk a lot about risk mitigation. We talk a lot about, is there a risk to your reputation? I gave an example of a plant shutdown, right? That's a pretty severe example, right? The other easy examples are patent litigation cases, right? Because that wasn't translated properly, or people made assumptions. There are risks there. It's like, what's the risk here? So I often sell based on risk.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in fact, I would not have thought about translation services as a risk mitigation tool. And yet it's obvious. Once you bring that up as one of the considerations, it's obvious, particularly when we think about whether it be training, whether it be the safety data sheets and all of the product information and usage information and hazard and risk assessments, it's obvious that it's a risk mitigation tool,
we're often
but it's not one I would normally have grabbed and said, oh yeah, this is what you do.
People tell us we're the biggest industry you've never heard of, right? It's like I've heard, you don't think about us until you need us. It's like, oh wait, we have and translation bloopers come, that's when we make the news, right? When someone has a catastrophe because the product brand name is a swear word in another language or whatever the case may be. So this is not an unusual response, Victoria. But you're right. It's so obvious when you put it out there, right? Isn't it? Communication there are barriers, and we remove those barriers. That the work we do removes those barriers, and that does typically mitigate risk. So,
how does AI fit into your world, right? I mean, that is such a hot topic. I've just recently interviewed somebody who has a science-based AI company on the podcast. But I mean, I think all of us think, oh, AI, I was looking with my daughter, one of my daughters earlier this week, who is heading to Japan for a school trip. And I was helping her do some research on some of the locations that she's going to and what else could she be doing if she's got free time and stuff. And, she told me basically, Mom, and I'm like, I'm looking for the English button on the website. Yeah. And she's like, oh, just hit the Google Translate, which is obviously an AI-based tool. How does AI fit into this? And is it going to take away your job?
So first of all, if you do that, if you just click it, whatever it is it's translating, you've just given them your intellectual property. So don't do that in anything other than translating the menu and working out the directions to get to the museum context. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I should not load my proprietary document into ChatGPT.
Exactly. Some contract that somebody sent you for review, you can't. I mean, now, of course, many large companies will have paid versions. There are paid versions that are secure that you can use. So to take a step back, though, to answer your question. So I think we're kind of ahead of the game on AI because we've been dealing with machine translation and the supposed threat of machine translation for years, for decades. Okay. So what now the language industry is looking at this thing. Oh, look, everyone else is seeing how it makes dreadful mistakes. Did you see the one about the lawyer who used ChatGPT to brief to provide anyway. So everyone's catching up and seeing the catastrophes that it can produce, right?
Got it.
So that's fundamentally where we've been for a while. So what I would say is there's absolutely fit for purpose cases where machine translation, the output of a raw machine translation, where you run it through a paid IP protected version of those softwares, can give you the gist of something very fast. So, someone scans in 200 pages of, I don't know, engineering drawings for a potential project you're looking at, right? Of course, run it through and see what you get. And then you might find that chunk in the middle is the really important part, and you send that on, right? So that would be looking at raw machine translation for gisting purposes. Got it. Then there's what we call post-editing, where a human takes that raw and tidies it up and gives you something that double checks it. So that is a workflow. It's perfectly valid workflow. We typically have both that workflow and the human translator, editor, proofreader workflow for clients. And it's according to need. Some of their material, your latest marketing campaign needs the human touch, right? It's got some creativity. It needs to have some polish to the language. Something you're reading for information, you can machine translate it, and then we'll have someone edit it, tidy it up a bit for you. So that's the way I look at it. So it's a tool, and like many professions or industries, the people who use the tools best will thrive, right? The people who don't use the tools well will fade away. So that's the way we look at these things.
And I think it's kind of the order of importance, I think, is, as your point is, like how critical something is. Right. If it's if it's a menu,
right, exactly,
throw it into a translator, and it's close enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's all about, is there risk to your reputation, your brand? Is there risk to life and limb? I mean, where are we on the scale? Is the risk that you don't like your dinner is rather different than is the risk to your brand, right?
Yeah.
Let alone life and limb. Yeah.
Interesting. So do you see yourself, other companies using AI even more to support what you do? Are you at kind of a static point, or is it an inflection point in the translation
No, I
industry as
wouldn't say
well?
it's an inflection point. The inflection point has happened for us.
Okay.
In terms of considering whether or not to offer it or suggesting it for the appropriate, we get a document from someone and they tell us the purpose of the translation. We usually know the answer.
Got it.
It takes no, I mean, I can take one look at something and at a purpose and say, well, we're doing that for this, aren't we? So, I just, so it's not an inflection point. Are we using it more? I would say that clients are more aware. So more potential clients are asking us, do you just do AI for this? And we do get the occasional client who comes, that someone, say a potential client comes in with an estimate and they get sticker shock. We had a consulting company for an engineering company come in with, they had these beautiful slide decks that they clearly use for all their pitches. To energy companies or chemical companies, let's say. They were an engineering firm pitching to larger companies, and they got sticker shock. I mean, beautiful slide decks, complex content, complex images, but that's a lot of work for humans to do that. And they had and they said, well, we're just going to run it through AI. We don't have any budget for this. And I thought, that's such a shame. You spent, I mean, how long did it take you to create these pitches? And now you're going to do that for this to pitch it in this other language. So it's that kind of question. Yes, we encounter people who just don't have the budget and haven't thought about the language needs. Of course we do, like every bit every service provider. You don't make every deal, right? So yeah, we see the whole spectrum of people who say, oh, never ever touch AI or machine translation for any of our jobs. We object in principle, all the way to people who are saying, what can you do to cut my costs?
Yeah.
So we have, like most businesses, we have a whole spectrum.
That's interesting. Well, good. So this has been great. What is next? What's next on your horizon for you and for MasterWord as you look ahead at 2023 and into 24?
Well, growth. We're looking at growth again this year, which is nice because some of there are a couple of, I would say, giants in my industry are sort of approaching the $1 billion mark. There are a couple of giants who we are competing with. They're not growing this year, but we are. So we're doing something right. So that's nice. So we have what we noticed among our service providers was a strong increase in cybersecurity needs in the supply chain, or that's something else that's happened that's come out of the pandemic. So we have just finished being audited for ISO 27001, which is the IT related ISO certificate. Everyone likes their supply chain to have. We've had the basic ISO for years and the niche ones, and then there's another one. So that has happened. And what's next is there's one specific to the medical device industry. So that's the life sciences med dev sector is another sector, obviously, that I'm very comfortable with. So the ISO certification related to the medical device industry is next on my radar because that will help me in growing that side of the business.
So what do the ISO certifications do for you guys? So I'm thinking about the ISO certification related to cybersecurity.
9001 is in supply chain, people want everyone has a quality management system, right? And it's much easier to be onboarded as a supplier when you've follow the same quality management system, right? So it's that simple. So lots and lots of service providers have quality management systems ensuring traceability and all the other things that quality management systems provide. So we've had one of those for ages. And like I said, there are niche niche ISO standards for, I don't know, machine translation or healthcare interpreting. We have those, but like I said, so cybersecurity is something we noticed a big push on, and we've been improving our internal IT systems. But when on those vendor onboarding, we qualify for diversity supplier, right? Obviously, we're a women-owned company, so a lot of companies are trying to increase their diverse supplier base, and we are just seeing huge amounts of questions related to cybersecurity in our IT setups. So having the credential, it ticks the box faster than having to write screeds of the poor director of IT having to actually answer questions, right? If you can say the credential, it checks the box. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, good. Yeah. This has been fascinating. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to talk about the service provider side of the supply chain, because like you said, we always think about the parts that aren't where they need to be when they need to be. But there are lots and lots of us.
But without the words, the parts sometimes don't matter.
That's right. So this has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening today. Keep listening, following, sharing, and we will talk to you again next week. Cheers.
We've come to the end of today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed your time with us and want to learn more. Simply visit thechemicalshow.com for additional information and helpful resources. Join us again next time here on The Chemical Show with Victoria Meyer.